One for Sam Bradford returns to Philadelphia to face his former team where he wasn't feeling the brotherly love from the Eagles, who took Carson Wentz with the second pick in the draft and eventually traded Bradford to the Vikings, leaving Wentz as the Eagles starter. But Bradford's new situation working out just fine as the Vikings are 5-0, the only undefeated team left in the NFL. Meanwhile, Wentz and the Eagles are 3-2 and third in the NFC East. Max, I want to start with you. Is this a bigger game for Wentz or Bradford?
Such a great question, because there are arguments on both sides, but the answer is it's actually a bigger game for Sam Bradford than Carson Wentz, Stephen A. Smith. It's a bigger game for Sam Bradford, not just because he's going back to Philadelphia, not just because the Eagles' defense, though, while very, very, very good so far this season, is not as good as the Vikings' defense, nor is it perceived that way. People aren't sitting around talking about, oh, my God, where's this Eagles defense going to rank all time? But people are actually starting to have those conversations about the Vikings. So if he loses to this Eagles team psychologically from that point of view, it's bad for Bradford. But it's more than that. I know you could point to the fact that the Eagles are like scraping and clawing in the NFC East, which should be tight, but now Dallas has put a little wiggle room and they got to keep up and all that, whereas the Vikings are undefeated. What do they have to worry about, right? But it's even bigger than that, too, because Carson Wentz, we're talking about quarterbacks here, got his whole career ahead of him. And he's the starter in Philly, and nothing going to change that this season. Sam Bradford, this is the year where he can redefine his career. He's not going to have a better chance than he has right now. There's no guarantee. It doesn't matter who the head coach is or what kind of personnel they have, that they have a defense that plays this well again. And for Bradford to become, as we've been talking about, Jim Plunkett, right? Can he become the guy who was taken #1 overall, injuries and kind of Midland success led everyone to say that's a bust as a #1 pick. Yeah, he's okay when healthy, but he's nothing special. And then he goes to a place after a pit stop somewhere else, exactly like Bradford. Then he goes to a place where he wins a couple Super Bowls, and all of a sudden you look and you go, yeah, that's a #1 overall pick. Bradford is in that moment of a potential renaissance in his career. If he goes to Philadelphia and loses at the place that just got rid of him, there is more, certainly from an emotional point of view, at stake for Bradford.
When you look at the Minnesota Vikings, they've got the worst running attack in football. They're averaging every 70 yards, like 70.6 yards per game, like on 2.5 carries. We know they don't have Adrian Peterson. That's going to put a lot of pressure on Sam Bradford to throw the football. Stephon Diggs having questionable health, over the last several weeks or so. Really, it's one of those situations where Sam Bradford walks into this particular game being 5-0. Still not losing much ground in the event that you lose this game, not having all the requisite weapons available to you. He's in a situation where I believe he's playing with house money. That's not necessarily the case with Carson Wentz. Now, obviously, he's a rookie, and clearly he's the future for the Philadelphia Eagles. But I'm talking about in terms of the shine that Carson Wentz was receiving, particularly comparable to that of Dak Prescott. Based on how he's looked over the last couple of weeks, especially last week against Washington, I think this is a bigger game for him. Not just in terms of stature, an elevated level of stature, but in terms of his own personal psyche. Because the last 2 weeks have been relatively rough for him. Not so much in a loss against Detroit, because that was a competitive game. He just threw an interception late in the game, throwing the ball deep. That didn't happen. But last week, they got pushed around by the Redskins. First of all, the Redskins come in their first 5 games. They had a 100-yard rusher one of those games. Last week, they rushed for 230 yards on the ground against the Philadelphia Eagles. Meanwhile, the Philadelphia Eagles defense couldn't generate anything offensively. They scored because of an interception by Malcolm Jenkins, all right, my frat brother. And then you also got a special team situation where they scored on a punt return. That's how the Eagles scored their touchdowns. Outside of that, they really haven't done anything. And they didn't do anything last week, rather. Meanwhile, Carson Wentz got smacked around, got hit about 11 times, got smacked up. And then you got to look at Minnesota. They've got about 3 different guys on defense. 3 different guys on defense. 4 linemen, with 3 or more sacks. You got Everson Griffin. You got Brian Robertson. You got Linval Joseph. That's at least the 3. You got 5 forced fumbles, all right? And so when you look at it from that perspective, they get all up in you. And their secondary is no joke because, again, passers are completing about 55% of their passes. Their quarterback rating is like 65. Everything points to Carson Wentz having a nightmarish day. If he can ward that off, all right, and especially if he's a big reason, if the Eagles win and he's a big reason why, then I think you've got something special potentially. But if he gets ramrodded for a second week in a row and they lose for a third week in a row, I think you're going to see some of that shine dim just a touch with Carson Wentz. And in that regard, I think that's why it's more about him than Sam Bradford. Because with Sam Bradford, again, without Adrian Peterson, with a suspect running game that's the worst in football, with everybody and their mama knowing that you rely on your defense in Minnesota in order to win football games and not turning the ball over. If Sam Bradford doesn't turn the ball over, but he's unable to get things done because of the requisite weapons that are missing from him, that's entirely different than if Carson Wentz goes out there and gets humbled to a point where we find ourselves concerned about a rookie who's being exposed as a rookie, because that's not something we're hearing about Dak Prescott, who's within the same division.
Look, usually these debates are very easy for me because I take the right point of view and just argue away your wrong point of view. But I have to admit, this time, this is a tough call. There's a lot at stake for everyone. You made some good arguments why it's more for Wentz than Bradford, but I could turn those arguments right around on you, Stephen A., which is actually why it's more important for Bradford. You talked about that Vikings defense. Everyone knows that about the Vikings defense. If you fail to beat the Vikings defense, that makes you different from every other quarterback that has played them so far. How? Including Aaron Rodgers. How? Not at all. They destroy quarterbacks. They shut down your offense. That's what they do. So if they do that to Carson Wentz, okay, it's the Vikings. And even then, he's 3-3. Now, you talk about comparisons to Dak Prescott. That's true. That'd be 2 consecutive weeks where he didn't look so good and Dak has continued to look good. It's still early in the season, and he is clearly their long-term answer at quarterback. Look at it from Bradford's point of view. This is simple. Matter of fact, this might even drop the mic on you, Stephen A. Smith. We got other things to talk about. Did they get rid of Carson Wentz for Sam Bradford, or did they get rid of Sam Bradford for Carson Wentz?
Well, they did offer Sam Bradford 2 years and $36 million, guaranteeing $22 million, before they realized they would be in a position to move up in the draft.
Right.
Their plan was to start Sam Bradford, but Sam Bradford raised holy hell and wanted out because his whole thing was clearly they're drafting Carson Wentz because he's the future. They didn't look at Sam Bradford as the future long term, but they were hopeful he would be the immediate future. When I spoke to Sam Bradford's agent on the phone at the time, he came on my radio show, Sirius XM, Mad Dog Sports Radio, every weekday, 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. He came on the show and he said, we were trying to get him out of town. We wanted to get him to Denver. When they originally signed him, we had a 2-year plan. It was only a 2-year plan, but we were going to use those 2 years to move on to greener pastures because we know that the Eagles, he didn't use the word reclamation project, but that's essentially what he was saying. They thought they had something with Denver, but that fell through. And so when you ask that question, Max, it's actually potentially both. Because what you do is find yourself in a situation where, okay, you got rid of Sam Bradford for Carson Wentz, or whatever other way you want to ask the question. At the end of the day, Carson Wentz is clearly the long-term plan. Sam Bradford was a short-term plan. But Sam Bradford had no interest in being a short-term plan. He wants to be a long-term plan elsewhere. That's what he wanted.
I have 2 questions for you.
That's what they were willing to oblige.
I have 2 questions for you. The first one is rhetorical. When one guy is not there anymore and there's a new guy there, they get rid of one guy for the other guy. Who do you think has more at stake, at least psychologically? That's the rhetorical question. The actual question is this, Stephen A. You said I can hear the Stephen A. Smith Show on Sirius Radio between 1 and 3 p.m. weekdays. I just want to make sure I get that straight.
Weekdays, Eastern Time.
Eastern Time. Got it. On Sirius. Stephen A. Smith, 1 to 3 p.m.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. Every day, every weekday.
No, that's all I needed to know.
All right.
There we go.
We'll leave it there. I'm very excited for this game. Might potentially be the best one of the week. Seattle and Cardinals could be a good one as well. But we had one last night. Aaron Rodgers, your guy, Stephen A., was 39 of 56 for 326 yards and 3 TDs, leading the Packers to a 26-10 victory over the Bears and setting a franchise record for completions. Rodgers struggled to get the offense moving in the first half, but the offense opened up in the second. Will we see the Aaron Rodgers we used to know this season, Stephen A., that bad man that you love?
I doubt it. And the reason why I doubt it is because I don't have that much confidence in his receivers. He dipped and dunked a lot yesterday, throwing the ball 56 times. Over 20 of them were for 5 yards or less, meaning that's how far he threw the ball. To me, that's not going to get it done. That's not the Aaron Rodgers that I know and love. The Aaron Rodgers that I know and love is whether he's in the pocket or scrambling beyond the pocket. The Aaron Rodgers that I know and love is the Aaron Rodgers that's going to fling the football downfield. I'm not sure that Devontae Adams, even though he had a big game, or Jordy Nelson, or Randall Cobb and those boys are capable of getting open in those situations against some of the better teams. I'm not getting caught up in the Chicago Bears. I think the Chicago Bears are a shell of itself. I think they're contaminated by the mere presence of Jay Cutler, even though he was on the sidelines and not playing. I think that Brian Hoyer going down didn't help matters. Barkley comes in, throws 2 interceptions. Their offense is anemic. As a result, you can take chances, and as a result, you can take chances on defense, but on the offensive side of the ball, you can afford to be methodical, dip and dunk, and beat them that way, chewing up the clock, and just march downfield, and that will be that. Against some of the better teams in the NFL, that's not going to work. I'm not saying that we won't see him. I'm saying that in terms of my confidence level, that bad man that I know him to be, I didn't really see much of that last night. And my attitude is that I'm not going to be convinced until I start seeing him fling that football down the field again. And in order for him to do that, those receivers are going to have seeing him fling that football down the field again. And in order for him to do that, those receivers are going to have to get open. And I'm not confident that that's what they're going to do.
I've been telling everyone to relax about Aaron Rodgers, not because, oh, he's going to go back right away to being what he was before last season, because now this is almost a season and a half, but because this guy is pretty good. I mean, he's better than most. So you still got a good quarterback. You're 4-2. But I also did not see anything new last night. I saw him playing a very bad team. Once Hoyer went down, they had no shot, and they're probably going to lose anyway. The defense really couldn't do much. And I saw him dinking and dunking a lot and really not picking up big chunks of yards. I mean, that was the substitute for the running game. Little dink and dunk passes. On the vertical passes, on the stretch vertical, down the field stuff, same guy, not that accurate. And by the way, where we disagree here is you're blaming his receivers. And certainly he doesn't have Jordy Nelson of a couple of years ago. And sure, that would make a difference. However, Casey Joyner, the football scientist, did tape analysis, tape-based analysis, broke down. He sits there and watches all this stuff and records when it's this guy's fault or that guy's fault. He said Rodgers was off target coming into Week 7, 37.7% of the time on his vertical passes. Those are aerial thrown 11-plus yards down the field. So none of these 5 and 6, and as you said, 5.5 yards a pass. You're throwing it down the field. He's off target qualifying quarterbacks based on the number of reps they've had. That's tape-based analysis that, according to Casey Joyner, showed, no, not his receiver's fault, not his receivers not being open, Aaron Rodgers not being accurate down the field. So then the question becomes, will we see that bad man again that you love to talk about, and I think is, when he's right, is the best, or was, at least till a season and a half ago, the best player in the game? And I'm not convinced we will this season. If you study great athletes in any sport, even the long-time great athletes, there's usually a little dip in their career at some point. They go through that athletic prime early, which is usually the best version of them we see, and then it looks like they're declining, and they're sometimes in their early mid-30s, and then they can have another stretch after that where they're, even if they're a little bit different than they used to be athletically, they're still more or less as good as they ever once were. Maybe a little less, but still approximating it. And usually I think that dip happens when their bodies start to change. They lose a half a step. They're not quite as good as they used to be. They can't get away with quite as much, but they also, because those changes are so imperceptible, they happen so gradually, they haven't yet adjusted to it. And I don't see evidence this season that Aaron Rodgers has adjusted to maybe what the new normal, what the new reality for him is physically, and therefore I have no reason to believe he will throughout the course of this season. He didn't last year. I don't think he's done as being in the conversation for the best player in the game, but I don't think that's going to happen this year.
Well, listen, I can tell you this. The important reasons as to why that is. And for me, Aaron Rodgers looks distracted. He don't look like himself. He was proud of Devontae Adams last night in the way that he was playing. I remember I was talking to Mark Schlereth on my radio show yesterday, and he was alluding to Aaron Rodgers and how, being distracted, his brother was on The Bachelor, family business got out in public, and all of this other stuff, I mean, just bringing in, some people have been bringing into the equation off-field things that may play a role in how a guy's psyche is and how he approaches the game and how he looks on the field in terms of playing the game of football. I'm seeing Aaron Rodgers underthrow and overthrow. I'm seeing him lose the football. Second consecutive week he's lost fumbles. This is a guy that's made a career not only of throwing beautiful passes, but protecting the football. That doesn't appear to be who he is right now. And it's very shocking to see this happen. And so I look at it from that perspective, and that's one of the things that concerns me about him.
Also, the Jeff Pearlman book came out about Favre, and it detailed some of the stuff in his relationship with Aaron Rodgers that was not so flattering for either, maybe particularly not Favre. But at any rate, for those who would dismiss off-the-field distractions as the reason that you could have a negative, it can negatively affect someone's performance, it's really very straightforward. It's common sense. If you have problems at home or in your personal life, does it ever affect your work product? For many of us, the answer is yes. For some, the answer is no. But for many people, the answer is yes. And that goes for athletes, too. And that may be part of the explanation, because what we're seeing the last 6 games this season, or 7 games this season, and all of last season is not the Aaron Rodgers that once was. It's still a good player, but not the best in the game.
Yeah.
Works for me. Works for me. For now, though, I haven't given up hope.
Yep. No matter how mentally tough you are, at the end of the day, we're all human, and it starts to affect you. Coming up next.